It's just after sunset and the road feels unusually quiet, the kind of quiet that makes every sound inside your car feel louder than it should. You've got both hands on the steering wheel, eyes forward, thinking about nothing more serious than getting home, when those red and blue lights suddenly bloom in your rearview mirror. You already know the routine. Slow down, signal, pull over safely. But something about this stop feels different. The officer doesn't approach casually. He's watching you longer than usual. One hand is near his belt, not in panic, but in habit, professional caution. Then he taps the driver's side window and asks the question that makes your stomach tighten just a little. Do you have any weapons in the vehicle? Or maybe it comes out slightly different. Are you carrying anything on you I need to know about? And suddenly, everything you thought you knew about being a responsible gun owner, about concealed carry laws, about your rights, about what you're supposed to say in this exact moment, feels a lot less clear than you expected. Have you ever been pulled over while carrying a firearm or been directly asked by law enforcement if you were armed, and what exactly did you say in that moment? If you've had that experience, I want you to share it in the comments because what most people don't realize is that the way you answer that question can quietly shape the entire direction of the encounter, sometimes in ways you don't notice until much later. And there's a reason so many otherwise lawful gun owners end up accidentally giving away more information, more control, and more legal ground than they ever intended to. Because the part nobody really prepares you for isn't just the question itself, it's what happens in the officer's mind while you're answering it. There's a moment in nearly every armed traffic stop that doesn't get talked about enough. It's that split second where a routine interaction turns into a risk assessment. The officer isn't just listening to your words, he's reading your tone, your pauses, your breathing, the way your hands move, the way your eyes avoid or meet his. And if a firearm is even possibly involved, everything speeds up internally for them, even if the outside appearance still looks calm. Now here's where things get complicated, and where a lot of gun owners unknowingly step into trouble. Because there is a huge difference between knowing your rights and knowing how your behavior is interpreted under pressure. In many states, the law says you are required to disclose that you are carrying if asked. In others, there's no duty to inform unless specific conditions are met. And in some constitutional carry jurisdictions, people assume silence is always the safest option. But law doesn't operate in isolation during a roadside stop. It interacts with perception, and perception is what determines how fast things escalate or de-escalate. What most attorneys who deal with firearm cases will quietly tell you is that the correct answer isn't just about legality. It's about clarity, tone, and control of the interaction. The officer asking about weapons is not always doing it because they assume you're dangerous. More often, it's because they're trying to eliminate unknown variables. A firearm is a variable that changes the entire safety calculation of a traffic stop. Whether you're a law-abiding concealed carrier or not, the presence of a weapon changes distance, positioning, and timing for the officer. That's reality, not paranoia. But here's where lawful gun owners often make their first critical mistake. They either over-explain or under-explain. Some people panic and start talking too much. Yes, officer, I have a firearm. It's in the glove compartment. I bought it last year. I have my permit somewhere. I wasn't doing anything wrong. I swear. And suddenly, what was a simple yes or no safety question becomes a stream of information that raises more questions than it answers. Others go completely silent or overly defensive. Am I required to answer that? Or why do you need to know? Even if legally justified in certain contexts, that tone can shift the emotional temperature of the stop in a direction you probably don't want. And this is the part most people never hear clearly enough. Officers are trained to treat hesitation, vague answers, or sudden nervous behavior as potential indicators that something is being concealed, even when nothing illegal is happening. That doesn't mean silence is wrong or disclosure is always required. It means the interaction is not just legal, it is psychological. Let's walk into a more detailed scenario. You're in a state with concealed carry permits required. You're licensed, everything is valid, and your firearm is holstered on your right side under your jacket. The officer approaches and asks for your license, registration, and insurance. Your hands move slowly. You inform him you have a concealed carry permit as you reach for your wallet. That's already a critical moment because you voluntarily introduced the presence of a firearm. The officer now shifts slightly, not aggressively, but deliberately. His awareness narrows. His attention splits between your hands and your waistline. Now imagine instead, same scenario, but you hesitate before mentioning the firearm. You're unsure whether you should say it immediately or wait to be asked. That hesitation alone can change the officer's internal narrative from cooperative armed citizen to unknown armed subject. It's subtle, but it matters. And this is where many experienced attorneys emphasize something important. Consistency and calm matter more than perfection. But let's complicate it further. You're a passenger this time. The driver is pulled over for speeding. You're carrying legally in a state where passenger disclosure is unclear or not required. The officer approaches and begins questioning both of you. At some point, he notices something that suggests a firearm might be present in the vehicle. Now the dynamics shift again, because now it's not just about your legal status. It's about control of the entire cabin environment. The officer may request that the weapon be temporarily secured, unloaded, or handed over while the stop is ongoing. And this is where confusion often spikes. A lawful gun owner hears, "Give me the gun," and immediately thinks about rights, Fourth Amendment protections, unlawful search concerns, and self-defense implications. But the officer is thinking about a different set of priorities: distance, access, and unpredictability inside a confined space. This is also where misunderstandings can turn a simple stop into a prolonged, tense interaction. Not because either side is necessarily wrong, but because expectations don't align in real time. And here's a truth that doesn't get said often enough. During a stop involving firearms, compliance and consent are not the same thing. You can comply with instructions while still not consenting to a search. You can cooperate while still being aware of your rights. But under stress, many people blur those lines or say things that unintentionally grant broader permission than they realize. There's another layer most people never consider until they're already in the situation: movement. The moment a gun is mentioned, every movement becomes more significant. Reaching into a glove compartment, leaning toward a center console, even adjusting your seatbelt can be misinterpreted if not clearly communicated. Officers are trained to expect sudden escalations in these scenarios, so they tend to react faster to ambiguous motion than they would in a normal traffic stop. This is why so many real-world encounters that start calm can escalate in seconds. Not because of bad intent, but because of mismatched interpretation of movement under uncertainty. Now let's talk about something that rarely gets broken down properly: why officers ask about weapons at all, even when there's no visible reason to suspect one. It comes down to risk management. A traffic stop is one of the most unpredictable interactions in law enforcement. The officer is outside, exposed, and often alone. The driver has the advantage of enclosure, concealment, and unknown access to objects inside the vehicle. Adding a firearm into that equation changes how every action is calculated. But here's the nuance. Most officers don't assume every armed citizen is a threat. In fact, in many states with high rates of concealed carry, officers regularly interact with lawful carriers without incident. What changes outcomes is not the presence of a firearm alone, but how predictable the situation feels. Predictability is everything in those moments. If you are calm, consistent, and clear, the interaction tends to stabilize quickly. If you are inconsistent, overly defensive, or visibly nervous, the officer has less confidence in what happens next, and that uncertainty tends to prolong the stop. And prolonged stops are where mistakes happen on both sides. Now let's address one of the most misunderstood ideas among gun owners: the belief that mentioning a firearm automatically escalates a stop. In reality, it's usually not the mention itself, it's how it's said. A calm, direct acknowledgement is very different from a rushed, anxious disclosure. One communicates awareness and control. The other can unintentionally signal unpredictability, even if nothing illegal is happening. There's also a common myth that officers always want to remove or confiscate firearms during stops. In most lawful situations, that's not the goal. Temporary separation may occur in specific circumstances, especially if the officer feels it is necessary for safety during the duration of the interaction, but it varies widely based on state law, department policy, and the specifics of the stop. And this is where things become legally complex quickly, because firearm laws are not uniform across states. What is perfectly routine in one jurisdiction can be highly sensitive in another. Constitutional carry states, permit to carry states, and duty to inform jurisdictions all create different expectations that can collide during interstate travel. That's why some of the most difficult legal problems don't come from criminal intent. They come from misunderstanding local variations while assuming consistency that doesn't exist. There's another scenario worth considering. You're stopped at night. You've got a legally stored firearm in the center console. The officer asks for your license, and while you're reaching for it, the console shifts slightly. Not because you're grabbing the gun, but because you're adjusting your documents. The officer notices the movement and pauses. That pause is critical. It's not accusation. It's assessment. In that moment, what happens next depends heavily on your communication. A simple, calm explanation, like acknowledging what you're doing, can prevent the situation from drifting into suspicion. But silence in that moment can allow assumptions to fill the gap, and assumptions in a high-alert environment tend to lean toward caution. That's the underlying theme in almost every armed police interaction. Gaps get filled, and they don't always get filled in your favor. Now, about that phrase, people often expect to hear from lawyers, the exact thing to say. The reality is, there is no universal magic sentence that guarantees safety, prevents escalation, or overrides situational judgment. Anyone who tells you otherwise is oversimplifying a system that is built on context, not scripts. What actually matters is consistency between your words, your behavior, and your legal status. Officers are constantly trying to reconcile those three things in real time. And here's where a lot of gun owners unknowingly sabotage themselves. They try to sound either overly authoritative or overly submissive, instead of just being clear and steady. Both extremes can create confusion. Another overlooked factor is fatigue. Officers who have worked multiple stops, especially at night, rely heavily on patterns. If your behavior matches a pattern associated with cooperation, things move smoothly. If it breaks expected patterns even slightly, attention increases. That doesn't mean you should perform calmness. It means understanding that unpredictability, even innocent unpredictability, carries weight in these moments. There are also cases where firearm owners unintentionally complicate things by trying to demonstrate compliance too aggressively. Rapid movements to show documentation, sudden reaching to get the permit, or interrupting the officer mid-question can all create unnecessary tension. Speed is not your friend in these moments. Clarity is. And then there's the emotional side nobody likes to admit. Even experienced gun owners feel a shift in adrenaline when a uniform is at the window and a firearm is involved in the conversation. That physiological response is normal, but it can affect tone, breathing, and timing in ways you don't realize. Officers are trained to pick up on those changes, not because they assume guilt, but because stress responses can correlate with unpredictability. That's why two people saying the same words can produce completely different outcomes depending on delivery. What makes this even more important is that many legal consequences in firearm-related stops don't come from the initial encounter itself, but from what happens after. How statements are recorded, how consent is interpreted, how searches are justified, and how reports are written can all trace back to the early tone of the interaction. So when people ask what to say when an officer demands or requests your firearm, the deeper answer is not a single sentence. It's understanding that every word you choose becomes part of a larger narrative being constructed in real time by both sides. And somewhere in that process, many lawful gun owners realize something uncomfortable. They were never just responding to questions. They were participating in a system where perception, law, training, and human psychology all overlap in ways that are not always obvious in the moment. There are encounters that end in seconds with no issue at all. There are others that stretch out simply because one small hesitation changed the officer's confidence in what they were dealing with. And there are cases where lawful carriers walk away realizing they unintentionally complicated something that didn't need to be complicated. What separates those outcomes more often than anything else is not bravado, not legal jargon, and not silence. It's controlled clarity under pressure, even when everything in your body is telling you to rush, over-explain, or shut down. And once you've seen how quickly these situations can shift, you never really look at that flashing light in your rearview mirror the same way again.